For a long time, the first thing many people saw of Detroit was a ruin. Michigan Central Station, 18 stories of Beaux-Arts stone standing over the neighborhood of Corktown, every one of its hundreds of windows broken out. It had opened in 1913 as one of the grandest train stations in the country, a marble palace where a traveler could arrive in the city that was about to remake the world. It closed in 1988, and for the next 30 years it stood empty, stripped by scrappers, tagged by graffiti, its great arched windows staring blindly out over a city that seemed to be emptying around it. Here is the detail that contains the whole story. Michigan Central opened in 1913. That is the same year, a few miles away, that Henry Ford perfected the moving assembly line at his Highland Park plant. The building that would become the symbol of Detroit's death and the innovation that would make Detroit the richest industrial city on earth were born in the same year, in the same town, within a short drive of each other. The station and the assembly line rose together, and when the industry that the assembly line created no longer needed Detroit, they fell together too. Underneath everything, the gleaming peak, the highest incomes in the country, the arsenal of democracy, Detroit was never quite the permanent, diversified metropolis it looked like. It was a company town. It was just a company town the size of a great city. The automobile was invented in many places, but Detroit, an old French-founded city already grown substantial on shipping and stoves and rail, was where someone figured out how to build the automobile for everyone. Henry Ford and his Model T, and above all, the moving assembly line he refined in 1913, turned the car from a rich man's toy into something an ordinary family could own, and turned car making from a craft into a colossal industrial process that needed workers by the hundreds of thousands. The other giants gathered in the same place. General Motors had been founded in 1908 by William Durant. Walter Chrysler built his company in 1925. Packard raised a factory in the city that covered 3.5 million square feet. In the span of a single generation, Detroit became the capital of the most important industry of the century. To feel the pull Detroit exerted, look at one number from 1914. In that year, Henry Ford announced that he would pay his workers $5 a day, roughly double the going industrial wage, an almost scandalous figure at the time. The announcement went around the world, and it turned Detroit into a magnet unlike any other city in the country. Tens of thousands of people poured in looking for work at that wage. It was the beginning of one of the great population movements in American history, part of the larger Great Migration that carried millions of Black Americans out of the rural South toward the industrial cities of the North. And Detroit, with its insatiable factories, was one of the great destinations. A person could arrive with nothing, and within a generation own a home. That promise, more than the cars themselves, is what built the city to its towering size. Detroit did not just make automobiles. It manufactured a version of the American dream and handed it to people who had never been offered anything like it before. And the people came. They came from the American South, black and white both, off the farms and out of the small towns. They came from Europe. They came because in Detroit, a man with no education and a strong back could walk into a plant and earn enough to buy a house and a car and send his children to school. And for a working person in the first half of the 20th century, there were few places on earth that offered a better deal. By the census of 1950, Detroit held roughly 1,850,000 people, near the fifth largest city in the country, and its residents enjoyed, by some measures, the highest per capita income in the United States. During the Second World War, the city had become the arsenal of democracy, its assembly lines turning out the tanks and aircraft and engines that helped win the war. Detroit was not just prosperous, it was, for a moment, the proof of what industrial America could do. A city where the machine had made ordinary people rich. The prosperity was not handed down purely by the companies either, it was fought for. Detroit became the beating heart of the American labor movement, and the rise of the United Auto Workers in the 1930s turned the auto factory from a place of brutal, insecure toil into the foundation of a middle-class life. After years of bitter and sometimes violent struggle, the union, led by a former Ford tool and die man named Walter Reuther, and the automakers arrived around 1950 at a landmark agreement so significant it was nicknamed the Treaty of Detroit, trading labor peace for high wages, pensions, and health benefits on a scale ordinary industrial workers had never known. This is the part that makes Detroit's peak so genuinely golden and its fall so bitter. For a moment in that city, a person without a degree could build cars, and in return, receive a secure, dignified, well-paid life. That deal, more than any building, was what Detroit manufactured. And it was that deal, as much as the jobs themselves, that the companies would spend the following decades escaping by moving to places where the union could not follow. That is the peak, 1950, and almost everything after it for the next 60 years is decline. The astonishing thing when you look closely is how early the fall began, and how quietly, because the same industry that built Detroit contained from the beginning the mechanism that would empty it. Here is the lever the whole story turns on. And it is not a riot, and it is not a corrupt mayor, though both of those will enter the story. The lever is that Detroit was utterly dependent on a single industry, and that industry, by its own internal logic, did not need to stay in Detroit, and did not need as many workers as it once had. Two forces did the work. The first was automation. The assembly line that had made Detroit was a machine for reducing the human labor in each car, and it never stopped improving. Every advance in efficiency meant the same number of cars could be built by fewer people, and fewer people meant fewer paychecks in the city. The second force was mobility. A factory is not a gold mine. It is not stuck to one spot by geology. It can be built anywhere, and once the companies realized this, they began building elsewhere. First, the plants moved to the suburbs ringing the city, taking the jobs and the tax revenue just past the city line. Then they moved to the American South, where land was cheap and unions were weak. Then in time, they moved overseas. Each move was rational for the company. Each move took a piece of Detroit with it. The relocation of the factories was not an accident of the market alone. It was helped along by policy and by design. After the Second World War, the federal government poured money into highways and into suburban home loans, and both of those decisions quietly drained the industrial city. The new interstates made it easy to build a plant on cheap, open land outside the city and truck the goods anywhere. So the companies did exactly that. The same highways and federally backed mortgages that favored new suburban construction made it easy for those who were allowed to buy in the suburbs to leave the city while still commuting to a job nearby. And crucially, that permission was not extended equally. Through the practice known as redlining, black families were systematically denied the loans and the neighborhoods that white families were offered, trapped in a city that was losing its tax base while being blocked from the suburbs that were gaining it. So the deindustrialization of Detroit was also a sorting of people, the jobs and the wealth and the white population moving out past the city line, the poverty and the black population increasingly concentrated within it. The market moved the factories. Policy decided who got to follow them. The city did some of the damage to itself, or rather, it was done to the most vulnerable parts of the city in the name of progress. In the 1950s and 60s, in the same wave of highway building and urban renewal that was reshaping the whole country, Detroit demolished some of its most vibrant black neighborhoods, districts known as Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, which had been crowded, poor, and segregated, but also intensely alive, full of black-owned businesses, churches, and one of the great jazz and blues scenes in America. One of the children raised in Black Bottom was named Coleman Young. He would live to become Detroit's first black mayor, elected in 1973, and he would govern for 20 years over a city whose wounds included the bulldozing of his own childhood neighborhood. Because bulldozed it was. The district was a race to build freeways and housing projects, the elevated interstates driven straight through the heart of Black Detroit. Thousands of people were displaced, a thriving, if impoverished, community destroyed, and the promised replacements never fully materialized. It was a self-inflicted abandonment, a case of a city destroying a living neighborhood on purpose and leaving a scar that never healed. The highways that replaced those streets are the same highways that then carried the white middle class out to the suburbs. So the very concrete that erased Black Detroit also helped drain the tax base that might have sustained it. Think about what that means for a city that had bet everything on one product. Detroit had been a real city before the car ever arrived, which is why its loss was never going to be simple arithmetic. But the metropolis of nearly 2 million was the car's creation, and it had no second-grade industry waiting in the wings, no other engine to carry the population the car had drawn in. So as the jobs bled out to the suburbs and the south and abroad, the city was left with the people, but not the paychecks. And unlike a mining camp that can simply be abandoned, a city of nearly 2 million cannot pack up and follow the work. It has houses, roads, schools, sewers, pensions, all built for a population at its peak. When the population and the tax base drain away, all of that infrastructure remains, and someone still has to pay for it, with less and less money every year. A shrinking city is one of the hardest things in the world to manage because the costs do not shrink as fast as the income does. On to that underlying economic collapse, the 20th century layered the wound of race, and it made everything worse. The racial fault line ran through Detroit's whole history, and it cracked open more than once. There had already been a major, deadly race riot in the city during the war, in 1943, driven by competition over jobs and housing as the migration swelled the population faster than the city would fairly accommodate. The pressures never really eased. Black Detroiters were confined by restrictive housing covenants and by a police force widely experienced as an occupying force rather than a protector. When the uprising came in the summer of 1967, touched off by a police raid on an after-hours club, it burned for days and left dozens dead, and it became one of the defining images of a decade of American unrest. What followed was not healing but separation. The families who had the means and the racial motive left for the suburbs in enormous numbers, taking their incomes and their property taxes with them, leaving behind a city that was poorer, blacker, and more isolated with every passing year. It is important to be honest here. The riot did not kill Detroit. The decline was already running when the fires started, and it continued long after they were out. But the events of 1967 poured accelerant on a fire that was already burning, and they hardened the divide between a struggling city and its prospering, separate suburbs. So the decades rolled on, and the numbers only went one direction. From that peak of 1,850,000 in 1950, Detroit's population fell and fell. It would eventually lose more than 65% of its people, dropping towards 700,000. A loss of well over 1 million residents from a single city. Try to hold that number in your mind because it is easy to let a percentage slide past. 1 million people is not a neighborhood or a district. It is the disappearance of a population larger than most American cities have ever had, drained out of one place over the course of a few decades. Imagine an entire major city, everyone in it, simply gone, and the houses and schools and churches they left behind standing empty, and you have some sense of what happened block by block across Detroit. And unlike the mining towns, where the emptying at least followed a clear and total logic, Detroit's loss was partial and jagged and cruel in its own way, because it did not empty completely. It emptied unevenly, leaving behind the people with the fewest options, concentrated in a city that had less and less to offer them, surrounded by suburbs full of the wealth that had left. A ghost town is, in a strange way, clean. Everyone is gone. Detroit was something harder to look at. A living city carrying the empty shell of a much larger one. Hundreds of thousands of people trying to make ordinary lives inside the ruins of a metropolis built for millions. Whole neighborhoods emptied. Houses that no one would buy were abandoned, then stripped, then burned, until parts of Detroit looked less like a city than like a prairie with streetlights. Blocks where one occupied house stood among empty lots returning to grass. The factories that had started it all closed one after another. The Packard plant, that 3.5 million square foot monster, fell silent and became the largest abandoned factory in America, a haunted cathedral of collapsing concrete that would stand derelict for decades. And over in Corktown, Michigan Central Station stared out with its broken windows, the perfect monument to a city whose engine had moved away. By the 1980s, the emptying had produced something the world had rarely seen, a modern American metropolis visibly reverting to ruin. Detroit became infamous for Devil's Night, the nights around Halloween when hundreds of abandoned buildings across the city would be set ablaze, arson on a scale that required the fire department to fight a small war every autumn. The abandoned structures multiplied faster than anyone could demolish them. A whole genre of photography grew up around Detroit in these years. Images of chandeliered ballrooms full of debris and schoolrooms with the books still on the desks, so common that critics gave it a dismissive name, ruin porn. The city's decay had become a kind of dark tourism, its suffering consumed as spectacle by people who would never have to live in it. That discomfort is worth naming plainly because you are, at this moment, watching a documentary about Detroit's ruins. The difference, if there is one, has to be in whether the images arrive with the history attached. And that is the bet this channel makes every week. The ruins produce their own bitter icons, and one of them says everything. The Michigan Theater was once a lavish movie palace, a gilded, chandeliered temple to the golden age of cinema, built in the 1920s on the very site where, by legend, Henry Ford had first tinkered with an early automobile. As the city emptied and the grand old downtown venues died, the theater was gutted, and rather than demolish the structure entirely, it was converted into a parking garage. So today, cars sit parked beneath a crumbling, ornate ceiling, the remains of a movie palace serving the very machine that built and then broke the city around it. It is almost too perfect a symbol, a cathedral of one era hollowed out to store the product of another. And it is real. Detroit is full of these places. The Packard plant sprawling and roofless, the abandoned schools and churches and stations, a whole museum of the 20th century left standing because there was no money to either save it or tear it down. All of this was building toward a single, formal, almost unbelievable moment. By the 2010s, the arithmetic of the shrinking city had become impossible. Decades of lost tax base, borrowing to cover the gap, pension promises made in richer times to a workforce that no longer had a city to pay them, and yes, some genuine mismanagement and corruption along the way had left Detroit with liabilities it could not possibly meet, on the order of $18 to $20 billion. In 2013, the state appointed an emergency manager, a lawyer named Kevyn Orr, to take control of the city's finances. And that summer, Detroit did what no major American city its size had ever done. It filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy in the history of the United States. The city that had once had the highest income in the country, the arsenal of democracy, the capital of the automotive age, stood in a federal court and declared that it could not pay its debts. When the bankruptcy came, the abstraction of $18 to $20 billion in debt translated, on the ground, into the daily degradation of ordinary life. For years before the filing, a huge share of the city's streetlights simply did not work, leaving whole neighborhoods dark at night. Police response times stretched to the point where calling for help could mean waiting the better part of an hour or longer. Ambulances were old and few. Parks closed, buses ran late or not at all, and the basic machinery of a functioning city ground down toward failure. Around the bankruptcy came another painful chapter: mass shutoffs of water to residents who had fallen behind on their bills, in a city where so many had so little, which drew condemnation from human rights observers. This is the part that the phrase "largest municipal bankruptcy in American history" can hide. The number is enormous and cold. The reality was a retiree watching a promised pension threatened, a family on a dark street waiting for an ambulance that took an hour, a child in a city that could no longer reliably keep the lights on. The bankruptcy is the accountability moment, and it is worth sitting with what it actually revealed. This was not a natural disaster. No flood, no earthquake. It was the slow, entirely predictable end of a city that had been living off a single industry and had watched that industry walk away over 60 years. And the people who paid were, overwhelmingly, the people who had stayed. In the proceedings, there was a real fear that even the treasures of the city, including the world-class collection of the Detroit Institute of Arts, might be sold off to pay creditors. In the end, a deal was struck, remembered as the Grand Bargain, in which foundations and the state and others put up money to protect the pensions and keep the art in the city. Detroit formally exited bankruptcy in December of 2014. But no bargain could give back the 60 years, or the million people, or the neighborhoods that had already gone back to grass. Quick note before we carry on. I put together a field guide to 24 of these places, where they are, what happened to them, and whether you can still get in. Coordinates for every site and an honest note on the ones that are already gone. Scan the QR code on the right or the links in the description if you want it. Now back to it. And here is where the story turns. Because Detroit is not Bodie, and it is not a ghost town, and it would be a lie to leave you thinking it was. Hundreds of thousands of people still live in Detroit. It is still a real city with real neighborhoods and a real culture, the birthplace of Motown and of techno, a place with fierce and enduring pride. In the years since the bankruptcy, parts of it have genuinely begun to come back. Downtown has filled in, and in the single most striking symbol of that turn, the Ford Motor Company, one of the companies whose whole industry had drained the city, bought Michigan Central Station in 2018 and spent years and enormous sums restoring it. In 2024, the great station reopened, its hundreds of windows filled with glass again, its halls alive, as the centerpiece of a new technology campus. The building that had been the world's image of Detroit's death became, at least in part, an image of its attempted return. The recovery, when it finally began after the bankruptcy, had visible engines, and it is worth naming them honestly. A billionaire businessman, Dan Gilbert, moved his mortgage company downtown and began buying up buildings by the dozen, filling long, empty towers with workers. The family that owned the Little Caesars pizza empire, the Illiches, developed a new district of arenas and entertainment. Money flowed back into a compact core of the city, and downtown Detroit today can look genuinely revived, busy and bright and full of new investment. But this recovery has a shape worth noticing. It is concentrated, driven by a handful of wealthy interests, focused on the downtown and a few adjacent neighborhoods, while vast stretches of the city, the ordinary residential neighborhoods where most Detroiters actually live, have seen far less. The city has spent years running one of the largest demolition programs in the country simply to tear down its tens of thousands of abandoned houses. A revival that reaches the core, but not the neighborhoods, is real, but it is partial, and it risks producing a city with a gleaming center and a hollowed-out remainder, which is its own kind of unfinished story. It is worth being careful and honest about what that recovery is and is not. A restored train station is a genuine achievement, and also, if you look at it a certain way, one more decision by the auto industry about what happens to Detroit. The city rose because the industry chose it, fell because the industry left it, and now sees a piece of its revival driven by the same industry choosing, for its own reasons, to come partway back. Detroit has never fully controlled its own fate, because from the beginning, its fate was tied to a business that could always, in the end, decide to be somewhere else. Set the two ends of the story side by side one last time. In 1950, Detroit had the highest per capita income in the United States, a city where the ordinary worker lived better than almost anywhere on earth. Within 60 years, that same city could not keep its streetlights on and stood in federal court unable to pay its debts. Nothing about that fall required a war or a plague or a natural catastrophe. It required only that the industry the city had married decide, rationally and repeatedly, over decades, that its money was better spent elsewhere. The people who had given the city their whole working lives discovered that loyalty runs only one direction, and that the direction is not toward them. There are cities and towns all over the country living some earlier chapter of that same story right now. Places where one industry, one plant, one employer is quietly the whole foundation, and where everyone assumes it will always be there because it always has been. Detroit assumed that too. So when you look at a photograph of Michigan Central Station, whether in its 30 years of broken-windowed ruin or in its restored and reopened glory, you are not looking at a freak of history or a uniquely cursed city. You are looking at the most spectacular example of an ordinary American pattern. A place gave itself completely to one great industry. For a while, the industry gave back more than anyone had dreamed. And then the industry did what industries do, which is to follow the money wherever it goes next. And it left a city of nearly 2 million people standing at the platform, holding the bill, watching the train pull out. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button in the middle to watch more forgotten places and abandoned history from across America. Then click the video on the left to watch similar stories like this. Or if you really want to get stuck in, click the playlist on the right. New videos every week. I'll see you in the next one.